China could have had millions more coronavirus infections than previously thought. Indians boycott Chinese goods after bloodshed at the border. And the teleconferencing app Zoom is censoring on behalf of China. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Well, I've got some good news for the coronavirus. It may not have just infected tens of thousands of people in China. It could actually have infected 2.2 million people, and that's just in Hubei province. Like I said, it's good news from the perspective of the virus. It's been very successful at spreading. It would definitely win at Plague Inc. Of course, that could be bad news for humans. In a study published earlier this month, microbiologists at the University of Hong Kong tested 452 people who evacuated from Hubei province to Hong Kong back in March. None of them had symptoms of the CCP virus, but 4% of them tested positive for CCP virus antibodies. According to the study, with a population of 59 million, our findings indicate that about 2.2 million people in Hubei could have been infected. That's more than 30 times higher than what Chinese officials reported. It's hard to be sure with such a small sample size. And actually, the scientists think that 4% may be an underestimate. But this could actually be good news for humans. It could mean the vast majority of people who've been infected never showed symptoms. And that means the CCP virus is not nearly as deadly as we thought. But it's also bad news, because if only 4% of people had the coronavirus in Hubei, the worst hit part of China, that's not enough to protect people from future waves of the virus. Meanwhile, my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, accused the Hong Kong University research team of publishing the study to help the United States attack China. No matter what, I can always depend on the Global Times. But China has more immediate disasters to worry about. Just this week, there were massive floods in southern China and huge tornadoes in northern China. And most frightening of all, a snake that laid eggs in a family's washing machine. Those eggs can only mean one thing. We're about to see a lot more snakes. Or an omelet. Of course, all disasters in China, whether natural or man-made, are opportunities for Chinese state-run media to show how great, glorious, and correct the Chinese Communist Party is. Like this article. But the US State Department disagrees. They've just designated 4 more Chinese state-run news organizations that have offices in the US as foreign missions. Those are China Central Television, China News Service, the People's Daily, and, my favorite, the Global Times. The State Department designated them foreign missions because, while Western media are beholden to the truth, PRC media are beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. Hey, that's a little unfair. Not all Western media are beholden to the truth. At any rate, these 4 Chinese state-run media organizations joined 5 others that were given the same designation back in February. In response, the editor-in-chief of the Global Times defended it as a market-oriented media, which is true in a sense, because this is their market. 105 Chinese soldiers flew to Russia this month to participate in their Victory Day parade. In Russia, Victory Day celebrates that time in 1945 when Germany surrendered to Russia after World War II. Now, it doesn't matter that Germany and Russia are both run by completely different governments than they were in 1945. It's still an excuse to show off your soldiers. And why not let your friends from China join? With no face masks or social distancing. Russia's Victory Day parade was originally scheduled for May 9th. It was postponed because of the coronavirus, and then it was rescheduled for this month. It's a show of strength ahead of an important constitutional vote that could give Vladimir Putin 2 more terms as president, lasting until 2036. At age 83, would he still look good shirtless on a horse? Good thing this show isn't Russia uncensored. The Chinese military has successfully launched into orbit the 35th and final satellite of its Beidou navigation system. Beidou is China's knockoff GPS. Of course, there are few other advantages to a country having its own satellite navigation network than prestige. Well, I can think of an advantage. For years, China's military has been relying on America's GPS for navigation. But with Beidou up and running, they don't have to worry about the US shutting off their access if there's a war. So now the Chinese military can feel free to start World War III without worrying about whether or not to make a left turn at Taipei or continue straight for 1,000 kilometers to invade Manila. Speaking of attacks, Canada. Yeah, bet you didn't think I was going to say Canada. But apparently, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has attacked China, at least with strong words, over China's political detention of 2 Canadians. As I mentioned last week, China has officially charged Canadian citizens Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor with spying. Everyone knows that those charges are a political retaliation for Canada's continued detention of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. Now, Trudeau has not always shown strength over the years when it comes to standing up to the Chinese regime. I mean, he's literally a panda hugger. But this week, Trudeau told reporters in Ottawa that it has been obvious from the beginning that this was a political decision made by the Chinese government, and we deplore it. And he said he will not simply trade Meng Wanzhou for the Canadian citizens, because anyone who is considering weakening our values or weakening the independence of our justice system doesn't understand the importance of our values. Wow, Trudeau has really toughened up. Must be the beard. And finally, things may seem bad with China right now, but CNBC has some advice for you on how to trade Chinese stocks during rising tensions with the US and a pandemic. Focus on Chinese A shares. Be selective in picking US-listed Chinese companies. And increase exposure to consumer stocks. Right. Can I just say, there's only one good way to trade Chinese stocks right now. Sell. And coming up after the break, how people in India are hitting the Chinese Communist Party where it hurts. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Indian government has suspended 3 major business deals with China, worth more than $600 million. And people there are boycotting products made in China. It comes after the most serious border clash between China and India in 4 decades. Chinese troops had set up a tent along the border, which is more like a disputed area than an actual line in the dirt. And it was part of a slow encroachment that China's been doing here for years. Here's the Chinese outpost on May 22nd. Here it is a month later, way bigger. On June 15th, Indian soldiers found that Chinese soldiers were not retreating from a disputed area as previously agreed. Instead, they were building structures. That led to an hours-long battle in the dark of night that left 20 Indian soldiers dead and many Chinese soldiers dead as well. India and China have now agreed to pull back and disengage so they don't accidentally start World War III. And that's good. Except now, China is all like, well, the entire thing was India's fault.
The responsibility is completely on the Indian side.
Plus, China is now demanding that Indian troops withdraw from the area. Now, from satellite images, it doesn't look like it's the Indian troops that are doing the real heavy building in the area. So basically, the Chinese regime is saying all this can be resolved peacefully, as long as you give me your wallet and your cell phone and your firstborn child. Well, the people of India aren't having any of it. Across India, people are calling to boycott China. And it's more than just a boycott of Chinese products.
Gathering the Chinese products from their homes and setting them on fire, burning effigies of President Xi Jinping along with the Chinese flag.
Boycott China protests are a big deal because China is India's largest trading partner. India's bilateral trade with China was worth nearly $80 billion in 2019. Chinese firms have plowed huge investments into some of India's most iconic tech brands, such as the ride-hailing service Ola, a fintech company Paytm, food delivery app Zomato, and e-commerce platform Flipkart. So boycotting Chinese products is no mean feat. Just think about the smartphones everyone has. Chinese smartphones are everywhere in India. Even American smartphone companies like Apple manufacture their phones in China. So if the boycotts get serious, people will have to go back to actually having to talk to other people again. Meanwhile, Chinese goods are piling up at Indian ports as the country tightens customs inspections. And the government has asked online retailers to show the country of origin for the products they sell. But while some say it's not feasible to completely boycott Chinese products, they also say that India should try to cut its dependence on Chinese imports. Ah yes, the great untold story of 2020, supply chains. But if the anti-Chinese Communist Party protests continue, I have one suggestion. Stop buying Chinese goods, fine, but try not to actually burn stuff made in China. You have no idea what you might be breathing in. And stay tuned, especially if you've ever used Zoom, because after the break, we'll tell you how Zoom is working with the Chinese Communist Party. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. We are now in what feels like year 300 of the coronavirus quarantine. And I know I'm certainly going a little batty from all the self-isolation. What's that, Shelley? I don't actually have an earpiece and I've been talking to myself the whole time? Shelley says the darndest things. I'm sure it's not just me who's starved for human interaction. And that's where Zoom comes in. Zoom is an easy-to-use teleconferencing app. And the coronavirus has been a big boon for business. Zoom has said it now has more than 300 million daily participants, up from 10 million before the pandemic. You've probably used Zoom at some point over the last few months, either to attend online classes or online meetings, or if you're very unlucky, an online Zoom party. Zoom is an American company. Its founder, Eric Yuan, was born in China, but is now an American citizen. And he says Zoom's mission is to deliver happiness.
Our culture is to focus on delivering happiness to each other, deliver happiness to our customers.
That's great, as long as those customers don't do anything to make the Chinese Communist Party mad. Then, no happiness for you. Zoom has canceled the accounts of US-based activists who held online Tiananmen Square massacre vigils, as well as the account of a Hong Kong activist. Why? The Chinese Communist Party asked them to. Here's what Zoom said happened. In May and early June, we were notified by the Chinese government about 4 large public June 4th commemoration meetings on Zoom that were being publicized on social media, including meeting details. The Chinese government informed us that this activity is illegal in China and demanded that Zoom terminate the meetings and host accounts. And so Zoom did terminate the meetings and host accounts of 3 of the meetings because they had participants from China. One account that was suspended belonged to Zhou Fengsuo. Zhou Fengsuo lives in the US. His account was suspended just days after his Tiananmen event. We actually interviewed him about what happened on a recent episode of the China Unscripted podcast. Check it out. Another account belonged to Chinese democracy activist Wang Dan. His account was actually shut down while he was hosting a Tiananmen event, so the whole thing went offline. Wang Dan also lives in the US. Separately, Zoom also terminated an account belonging to a Hong Kong activist named Lee Chuk-yan. It was shut down minutes before he was going to stream an interview with another Hong Kong protester. And again, Zoom did this because the Chinese Communist Party asked them to do it. That doesn't look like delivering happiness to me, unless Eric Yuan got happiness confused with censorship, an easy mistake to make. Eventually, after lots of embarrassing media coverage, Zoom reinstated their accounts and apologized, but not for what you'd think. First, they pulled the whole "don't be mad at us, we had to comply with local laws" move. That's been a common refrain for businesses who censor for China. In Zoom's case, it's a little unclear what local laws they're talking about, though. Zoom did say that the Chinese government told them it was illegal, but we don't know why. Because in China, there's technically no law against holding a Tiananmen Square massacre vigil. Plus, China's constitution technically guarantees free speech and press and assembly. But Zoom didn't shut down accounts in China. They shut down the accounts of people in the US and Hong Kong. So Zoom should have been complying with the local laws in those places, which not only guarantee free speech in their constitutions, but actually guarantee free speech. Like, for real. So the whole comply with local laws excuse is nonsense. But that's not what Zoom is apologizing for. Their actual apology is that we shut down the meetings instead of blocking the participants by country. Yeah, they're sorry they didn't just block users in China. But don't worry, Zoom is going to develop the technology to be able to block users in China. Hooray! You see, Zoom was one of the few holes in China's Great Firewall. That's the system the Chinese Communist Party uses to censor everything on the Chinese internet. Before a time, Zoom allowed people inside China a way to freely communicate with the outside world. And it was incredibly popular. Zoom's mobile program has been downloaded 5.4 million times from Apple's China store since January 1st. And it was particularly important for Chinese activists, who had things to say that could get them arrested if they used a Chinese-based platform like WeChat. Users in China include people and organizations from underground religious groups to women's rights activists. They see the service, Zoom, as a rare window to the rest of the world. Well, they did, but the Chinese Communist Party, with the compliance of Zoom, has been gradually closing that window. Last September, Zoom's services in China were briefly suspended. How did Zoom fix it? They made it so Chinese users could no longer host calls unless they made a registered account. According to China's cybersecurity law, registered accounts need to use real name registration for the service, a process that links Chinese internet users' identity to an account via their phone number. This way, Chinese authorities can find them. By the way, Zoom's new requirement came in response to a call from China's Ministry of Public Security. But Chinese users could still join international Zoom calls anonymously. In fact, Zhou Fengsuo, who hosted that Tiananmen vigil on Zoom, said there were 250 people on the call and as many as half may have dialed in from China. But now, Zoom will fix this hole in the Great Firewall. And I understand why. China has a huge market that Zoom wants to deliver happiness to. But it's more than just that. Many of its research and design personnel are in China, which it has said helps it keep costs low. In fact, ahead of its IPO last year, Zoom listed having engineers in China as one of their key profit drivers. Since they don't have to pay them as much as in the US, that means more profit for Zoom. Zoom also has big data centers in China. The Chinese Communist Party can access any data that goes through China, which shouldn't be a problem for us in America, because our data stays in, oh dear. Zoom's connection with China is why some people are very concerned about its security. Taiwan has banned government employees from using Zoom for official business. So have Google, NASA, and more. Zoom has also been sued by its shareholders for overstating its privacy standards and not disclosing its massive privacy and security flaws. The good news is, this dangerous problem has brought together Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. In April, a bipartisan group of 19 U.S. lawmakers asked the FTC to investigate Zoom. And now, another group of bipartisan U.S. lawmakers wants Zoom to clarify a few things. They have a list of 8 questions for Eric Yuan to clarify Zoom's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. But one of those questions is a particularly dangerous trap. Does Zoom routinely share data with the PRC government, and if so, what kind of data does it share? The U.S. government may already know the answer. Misleading the senators could pose legal jeopardy. And that's a kind of jeopardy I don't think Eric Yuan wants to play. So now, Zoom faces a choice between the U.S. and China. As long as Zoom has employees and data centers in China, it will be beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. And that will increasingly undermine its business in the U.S. and the rest of the world. But it's not just a problem with Zoom. U.S. tech companies have been complicit with the Chinese regime for decades. After all, Cisco helped build China's Great Firewall because they thought it was a great chance to sell more routers. And they never learn. Like when Google tried to secretly develop the Dragonfly search engine for China, until their plans were leaked and then terminated after a huge backlash. But Google and its parent company Alphabet still have hundreds of millions of dollars invested in Chinese companies. So far, American tech companies have been able to walk a fine line between bowing to the Chinese Communist Party's demands and justifying their actions to the U.S. government and the American people. But as the U.S. and the rest of the world harden their stance against the Chinese Communist Party, companies like Zoom are going to have to make a choice. And that's it for this week on China Uncensored. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.